Let's learn. Today we're going to be focusing on a standalone topic, and the topic is, do ideas matter? And of course the answer is, of course ideas matter, but it's not as simple as meets the eye. Why is that? Because, first of all, if you think that ideas matter, then why don't we speak about ideas so much? Most of our life we don't talk about ideas. I remember there was an interesting statement saying that average people talk about people, and more intelligent people talk about things, and intelligent people talk about ideas. We don't spend an awful lot of time talking about ideas in general. We talk about the weather, we talk about the traffic, we talk about all kinds of things. We talk about frustrations, aggravations, work, and all those kind of things, but we don't really spend so much time talking about ideas. If you think about the sum total of our life and how much time we spend talking about them. Now, I'd like to investigate it from a very unusual angle, which I think that perhaps we overlook. Let's start at the beginning. So this is a Gemara which describes a story which is well known, but the angle on the story is lesser known. Here's how it works. The Gemara is describing the end of one of the 10 martyrs' lives. So there were 10 people around the time of the Hadrianic persecution following the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash, in which there were 10 people killed by the Romans. One of their names was a person by the name of Hananiah ben Teradion. He was a very famous person. He was a teacher, an interpreter of Torah in the public, and he this is the end of his life. So we're told the following in source 1. Tana Rabbanon keshechola Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma halach Rabbi Hananiah ben Teradion levakro. So Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma, one of the great Tanaim, was ill. Here Rabbi Hananiah ben Teradion comes to visit him. Amalei Hananiah achi, he says, Hananiah, my brother, don't you know that this is a divinely ordained nation that's going to take over? Why? Sheikh Riva is Beso that destroyed the Beis Hamikdash, the Sarfa is Seichalai, destroyed burnt the innermost sanctum, Vargois Achasidov, and killed his pious ones, V'avda es Tuvoi, and destroyed all the goodness, V'adain who he kayemes, and this empire still exists. I hear that despite all of this, despite all the signs in the tea, right? This is not even in the tea if you think about it. It's like, look around, read the news, see what's happened, and you still sit there teaching Torah, right? You're going against the tide of everything that's around us. Why? So he says, God, heaven should have mercy on us. That's on me, essentially. That's what Rabbi Hananiah ben Teradion responds. Amalai, ani omer lecha dvarim shel tam v'ata omer li min hashamayim yirachamu. He says, I'm telling you logical ideas, and you're telling me God's going to have mercy on you. Tama ani, I would be surprised. Im loy yisrafu oscha v'sefer Torah ba'esh. I'd be surprised if you and your Torah would not get burnt soon. That's a very dismal outlook, but this is that's the reality that they're living with during this period. Amalei Rebbe, he says, what is it about to be for me and the world to come? And he goes and he asks him about, were you very careful about your stock giving? And then he says, and he talks about how one time he got mixed up with his own money and Purim and stock, and he distributed all his own money to avoid this. And he says, you're definitely going to enter into Olam Haba. Okay. Amru loy, in the next paragraph, loy yomi mu'atim ad shenifta Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma v'holchu kol gedali yisro romi levak rovi hispiduhu hesped gadol. So all the dignitaries of Rome came to eulogize Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma v'chazaras al matzon lo Rabbi Hananiah ben Teradion sho yoshev ha'osek b'Torah. So the dignitaries come from the funeral of Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma, who was obviously famed even in the Roman circles, and they find that Rabbi Hananiah ben Teradion is sitting there teaching Torah in public. They took him, wrapped him in the Torah scroll, and they put him in. They ensconced him in bundles of wood, and they lit him on fire. And they placed wet sponges. They placed it around his upper chest, that he should suffer through the burning. His daughter said to him, Abba, how can I see you in such a way? He says, if I was just being burnt at the stake, That's one thing. But I'm being burnt with the Sefer Torah. God's gonna claim justice on the Sefer Torah, and He's going to claim justice upon me as well. Amar Eloi Talmidov, and this is the critical line. Rebbe Ma Torah. They say as he's burning at the stake and he's being preserved in this terrible torture. They say, Rebbe, what do you see? Strange question to ask, but it's almost like sort of how do you make sense of all of this? That's essentially what they're asking. Amar Lohen, he screams out to them, Gilyon nisrafin v'oisios parachos ba'avir, or Gvilin nisrafin and the oisios parachos ba'avir. That he says that I see that the scroll is being burnt, but I see the letters are flying free. That's what he says. And then they ask him an interesting question about whether he can open his mouth, which would allow more air in, which would allow the burning to go fast and him to die fast, and he refuses to do so. And that leads to an interesting discussion in palliative care in general. But be it as it may, this statement over here is such a famous statement. This is such a poetic statement. It's a statement which has been memorialized in so many ways. It's even been memorialized in our own shul lobby, because the main focus window in our lobby is this statement of Rabbi Chanani ben Tradian, which is that the Gevilin Nisrafim va'oisios parachos ba'avir is the orange, the fire at the bottom of that stained glass window is the fire consuming the Torah, but the letters flying out, which means to say that you might be able to consume the biological material, but you cannot consume the innermost core. And what generally understood in this Gemara is being said is a metaphor for the nation of Israel, which is essentially the rebuttal to Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma. Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma said, surely you can see that look who's in charge. Look at the dominion. Look at the base midrash has been destroyed. What do you say about that? How can you continue to teach? And he says, you know what? Never will the Roman Empire ever control the soul of the nation of Israel. That's what he's essentially saying. They may control our bodies, they may burn our bodies as they are mine, but they will never control the future of the nation of Israel. That's what's being described over here, and it's a very powerful statement which has essentially been a guiding light for us through the many times that the Jews have been burnt, and many times they've been killed. Whether it's Artaud phase in Spain, whether it's the Holocaust, that the scrolls, so to speak, the bodies of Israel have been hurt and tortured and destroyed, but never was the soul of Israel ever destroyed. And that's what Rabbi Chanani ben Tradion is essentially saying. And it's ironically, the metaphor is true. And here we are today, and maimed and limping and scarred, but yet we're here. And that's what Rabbi Chanani ben Tradion was saying. However, that's the classic way of reading the Gemara. When Rav Hershel Shlita was here just a couple years ago in our shul, he read this Gemara and he said something different in interpreting this Gemara. And it's that idea that I would like to focus on. He read this through this Gemara and he said that, you know what this refers to? It refers to bigger than that. He says that this Gemara is describing the fact that you cannot kill an idea. You cannot kill an idea. The Torah Shebichsav can be controlled by external forces, but the Torah Sheba'al Peh can never be stamped out. That's a very, very powerful statement to think about. And I'd like to think about that notion, that the fact that an idea cannot be stamped out. That concept has played itself out in history multiple times. Let's talk about some examples of this in secular history as an example. So one of the greatest events, or not great as a judgment, but one of the most powerful events which affected Europe in the last 1,000 years was the Reformation. The Reformation was when finally a group of people, or numbers of people, said that the Catholic Church is not doing its job. They're using funds, public funds, to feather their beds, to make their buildings, to enrich the priesthood. But in the end of the day, they are all self-centered, and it was a pretty good assessment of the times. And so there were many people who fought against this. One example, so this classic example, is Luther, who was a terrible person when it came to Jews, but when it came to his perspective on Christianity, he famously, on the date of October 31st, 1517, he nailed to the front of the church in the Wittenberg Castle, he nailed to the door what was called the 95 Theses, where his ideas of what was wrong and what was supposed to be with Christianity. And as much as the Catholic Church fought and as much blood was spilled, this changed the face of Christianity. Protestantism took off, and this is the Germanic areas, the area of England adopting this. This changed the way that the church operated. All of Europe was overturned by a idea. And as much as you could kill people, you couldn't kill the idea. That is one example of when no matter, yes.
But many ideas have been killed by either being disproven scientifically, intellectually, mathematically.
True. Good. So I'm going to get to that in a second. I'm just going to, right now I just want to use a few broad strokes to talk about how difficult it is to kill an idea. And then I'd like to address your point, which is a very, very good point. Another example is Mein Kampf. Right? So Mein Kampf was written in the 20s. And this book, written in 1925 specifically, which actually means My Struggle, written by Adolf Hitler, Yamach Shemo v'Zichro, was a person who really, it was his manifesto for the atrocities that he was about to perpetrate. It was about German pride, the Aryan race, about its distinction and solving these problems. It was about his plans with the Jews. He meant what he said, and you know what? He did it. And millions of books were sold. It made him a multimillionaire by the late 30s, just to understand this. But it was more than just the money that he got out of it. It was the fact that this was essentially his guidebook. Do you know something interesting, just if you're reading recently, the copyright or the ownership, the rights of ownership of printing of Mein Kampf were given to I believe, to Bavaria. And they disallowed the printing of Mein Kampf for 100 years because that was when the rights ran, but I think the rights ran out. I don't know why it was, but I think in the end of 2016. At which point in time, there was a great controversy because now the rights ran out and everybody started printing again. And guess what? It's a number one print in a number of countries in Eastern Europe today. Right? So the idea is back, even though it is disallowed. The idea is somehow this nefarious, this evil idea continues. Even today, it's very hard to stop ideas. Another example is Das Kapital, right? Written by a Jewish man, of course, Karl Marx. And if you think about how much that book about communism and the idea that a communist ideal has affected nations, has affected countries, has affected the world. Look at Russia, China. Look at the war, the Cold War, right? All stemmed from one idea, which changed the world itself. And no matter how much, whether it's the McCarthy era, when you talk about trying to stop ideas, it's very difficult to stop an idea. Now it comes back to Nachman's question, which is, but it requires a little more sophisticated thinking than that. Or just to throw in here as well, for anybody who had as their reading set work in school, Fahrenheit 451, right? So this is a book written in the 1950s, which was specifically about, again, it was written in the shadow of Soviet, the rise of Soviet ideas, which was stamping out of ideas. There was the notion that we can eradicate ideas in the wake of Nazi book burning, where they sought to stamp out ideas. And the concept behind the book, I thought it was a little too excessive, but the idea behind the book, sort of in the 1984-esque type of book, is about an era in which that books were disallowed, that all books were burnt, and the firehouse, the firemen, were the people called not to put out the fires, but to burn the books. And it's about this internal struggle of a particular fireman who wants to save books and read them. And it's the resurgence of ideas through the memory of people, not through the script of books. There's a lot to talk about when it comes to this, but the idea again is you cannot stamp out ideas so easily. And that's what the Gemara was saying by Rabbi Hanani ben Trajan, is you can't stamp out an idea. The idea will live on, sometimes for the good and sometimes for the evil as well. And what was that?
The Proud Boys.
Right, there's a lot of ideas. You can take them off social media, but there will be a resurgence somewhere else. Now it leads to an interesting question: is this is far too broad a stroke to be fair? So the idea actually is a little more complex than that. And this is a theory. This is a model of a theory, which I think is important to appreciate. Is that an idea needs to be essentially married to practice or experience for an idea to survive. What does that mean? So let's just put this in basic terminology. Let's think about degrees and and vocations, right? So today what happens is that for anybody to get a job in we'll call it a desk job or a profession, right? We're not talking about business, we're not talking about sort of hands-on skills. Vocation also but a job which requires a higher level thinking. A person needs to essentially go to college to get a degree to educate themselves in order to be able to work in a thinking in a high level thinking job. But if you examine what is put into the degree and you examine what the person's doing, very often there's actually very little to do with it. So let's say your average person wants to become an accountant, right? So they need to learn a lot about accounting. They'll take a lot of courses in university. But truth be told, and even when you get your master's with a requirement of 150 credits today, and then you need to go through the 4 exams in order to get there, in the end of the day, very little of that actually relates to what is going to be put across the desk of the intern as they start their work, as it happens, right? Now, if they didn't have any of those prerequisites, they would be far less equipped to deal with the job, but those ideas don't necessarily match the experience on the ground itself, right? Is that interesting? The same works like this with anything. Like, let's talk about marriage for a second, right? So, Ari says, you've got to read all these books on marriage before you get married. It's like, and then you get married, and you realize that all that theory is very nice, but that in practice, it's much more complicated when it comes to biting your tongue when somebody says something that you didn't like, right? And it's all very nice to read those beautiful ideas and those little wortlach, and but in the end of the day, it doesn't match up. Which means to say that for an idea to be true, there needs to be the melding of the idea itself and we call it the experience. I'm sure we've had this notion where you're going through in life and you suddenly hear an idea and it matches precisely what you're going through right now, and you're like, my goodness, why did nobody tell me this before? And the truth is, they probably did. But you know why you didn't hear it? Is because your experience had not matched up with that idea yet, right? You were not in a space in life where that idea mattered enough to resonate, to be remembered, to make any effect in life, right? Because my experience and the idea are not in tandem yet. In order for an idea to be real, you need to have experience matched with the idea, which is why it's important to have continued education when it comes to jobs, which is why it's important when it comes to relationships, to be working on the relationship in theory as well as in practice at the same time. All this idea of theory beforehand and practice afterwards being divorced from each other doesn't really work. This is the notion. Let's sort of play this out into bigger life experience. What does life look like in the absence of ideas? What does life look like when you don't get involved in ideas? It's the relationship which is never worked on, right? It's the society which just goes but never has any thought leadership, doesn't have universities, doesn't have critical journalism, which doesn't have people sitting in the academy, not in industry, actually revising and rethinking where it's going, not calling out that perhaps even a judicial switch might have dangers coming down the river, right? These are things that are important for society, because otherwise it'll either at best be a monotonous society or at worst be a society which is dangerous. If you take the other idea, what is a society that has ideas but does not have practice? Those are the ideas that die, right? So if you have an idea which has not ever been tried, put against a null hypothesis and dented, it's not really an idea, right? It's just an idea without the real practice. In fact, if you think about this, think about how revolutions work for a moment. What happens is you have an ideologue, right? So you have somebody who kind of gets up there and says, it's not fair, we need to have, let's think about, the communist revolutions, right? So there were 2 revolutions in 1917, right? White and red. So if you're just following what happened that year, but who, so to speak, led the revolutions? Well, there were ideologues who'd been people who professed communism and equal rights and the more power to the many. But in the end of the day, who actually drove the revolution were the people who didn't have bread on their table. Think about that. It wasn't the people who had the ideas. They were at the front of the crowd, but they weren't the people with the pitchforks.
French Revolution.
Right? Think about the French Revolution. Think about any revolution. You have what you need to have the correct combination, the so to speak, that perfect storm of ideas coupled with experience. What's experience? The people who have a bad economy and can't afford to pay for basic food. Put the two together, now you have a revolution. With just disenfranchised people, you have anarchy, right? You have places like Venezuela, right? With just an idea, without the other people, you may have a few bloggers, but you're not going to have a revolution. You're not going to have change. That makes sense? Right? You need to have both in order for it to work. So I was thinking to myself, how do you map that out? Like I'm very visual. How do you map that out? Like what would that look like in like a Venn diagram? And so the answer is Rabbi Hanani ben Tradion already told us, right? What was his relationship between idea and experience? Is an ois to a gvil, which means letter. What's gvil? Parchment. And the Gemara actually dictates already what the relationship between the two are. In fact, the Gemara says in Menachos, in source 5, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav lo nisrucha ela lekutza shel Yud, v'onami pshita ela lechirechter Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. This is the main point. This is the second line. Amar Rav Yehuda Rav al kol ois she'ein gevil mukaf v'lo mi'arba ruchaseh psula. There's a halach when it comes to writing a Sefer Torah and when writing tefillin and mezuzos that you need to have what's called mukaf gevil. That means to say a letter needs to be completely surrounded by parchment. So you say, well, what's an example of an exception to that? Take a look at the picture I put in over here. That's an example of not mukaf gvil. Let's say there's, as an example, there's a crack in the parchment, and the crack leads just to the letter, but it doesn't infringe upon the letter. Or let's say you write a letter just at the very edge of the parchment. In that case, it would not be considered mukaf gvil because it's not fully encompassed by, not completely surrounded by the parchment itself. Is that fascinating? I think that's precisely what this notion is. You need to have an idea. You need to have an ois, an undying idea. But it's not real until it is subsumed and surrounded by gvil, which is the experience in which it is supposed to affect. If you don't have the two, it's possible. That's what I would suggest is going on over here. Few interesting examples over here. So I mean, this is Paskin in Halacha in the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch talks about this in Lamed Beis, which is the beginning of Hilchos Tefillin, where it talks about all the halachas about this, and it talks about this requisite spacing around letters when writing. But more than that, there's an interesting halacha when it comes to a Megillah. When you write a Megillah has its own unique set of halachas, which are slightly different to the halachas that pertain to a Sefer Torah. And there's a whole discussion: can you write it in another language, or what happens if you write it in one language in a different script? So the Shulchan Aruch says in source 6, "Ha'is ksuva tirgum." It was written in a translation of Lashon Acheres, Milashon Sa'akum, in another language. Lo yatzad yadei chavasa b'kriyasa. You do not discharge your responsibility. Ela hamakir oisa lashon bilvad. Only a person who realizes. They say it's written in German. Aval im ha'isa ksuva b'ksav ivri v'kara aramis la'arami lo yatzad. If it's written in one language, you read it to a person who doesn't understand that language, then it doesn't work. Because you're really reading it al peh, because you're translating as you're reading. So technically speaking, it could be written in another language as long as the recipient, the reader, is hearing in that language and understands it. Says the Ramah, it doesn't matter what writing it's actually written in. Says the Kav HaChaim on the Shulchan Aruch over here. Let's say a Megillah is written in a different language. The halacha is, if it's written in a different language, the halacha of mukaf gvil is not necessary. The notion that an idea, the ois, and the gvil needs to surround it is unique to when it's written in Hebrew. Judaism requires an idea to be grounded fully on all sides. It cannot simply exist in the ether. It cannot simply exist on the parchment by itself. In fact, the Rav Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the Alter Rebbe, talks about this in Shir HaShirim, and he says, what does this mean? Take a look at this incredibly deep idea that he says in source 8. Ki inyan limud Torah, when you learn Torah, afshek far yodei halacha, mitzvah la'asoik ba kedei lahamshich or ein sof baruch hu, she'egilui or ein sof lemata. It's not enough to think about Torah. It has to be that you don't learn Torah, you live Torah. La'asoik, right? To be involved. V'lo yalavush mastir klal. V'gilu is there. This revelation. Hu v'minoi telchabkeni. That means that my right hand his right hand will embrace me. Ka'adam hachavek es chavera, like a person being embraced by their friend. Ve'ena manicha lipared. And he goes mi'inyan yimino telchabkeni, and he goes on to quote a source in this v'nikra kachoisam alibecha meritzuas t'talyan aliba ki hine hatfilin hem oisos hakesuvim ala klaf. Let's think about tefillin for a moment. He says tefillin is letters written on a parchment. V'tzorich liyos mukaf gvil idei midalad ruchasov. Each letter needs to be completely surrounded by parchment on all sides. Ki ha'oisos hem bechinas ha'aloas ha'nefesh b'ashgacha. The soul is in a certain sense, the metaphor for the soul is this letter. However, aval klaf hu lemala min ha'oisios ki hu ha'noisei v'sovel es ha'oisios. The parchment envelops and captures and couches that idea, that soul of Judaism. V'hinei klav zeh hu ha'or shmimino retzuas hakol hu rak bechinas or behema b'tahira v'retzuas hanimshachas min haklaf azeh hem talyin alibo lias giloi avo belev v'lias v'yimino techabkeni. He says, in fact, it's the same biological material that the parchment is made of, which is the straps as well, which essentially means is that the idea expresses itself outwards in a real biological material, which extends itself like the straps down past the heart of a person. So it's not enough to live in the realm of ideas. It needs to be that idea, so to speak, expresses itself in the full expression of the biological material, the real life, the nitty-gritty, the weeds of my life need to be an expression of those ideas. That's what seems to be going on over here. And that's the balance that Judaism strives for. If you think about it in the other way, and from another perspective, let me just sort of describe this from another angle. You know why communism doesn't work? I just thought about this for so long. It's such an interesting thing to think about. It's such a brilliant idea. I mean, Karl Marx, brilliant. Just such a noble, just idea. Why does such a just idea not work? How do we know it doesn't work?
Which idea are you
Well, there's many ideas, you're right. But the answer is that in the end of the day, communism does not work because it doesn't work in practice. It doesn't work. The human nature cannot, maybe the kibbutz movement has been the closest towards that type of idea, but it doesn't work. There are those who are more equal than others. Human nature will demand demand certain things that the system of equals will not be able to present, and ultimately it will fail. It will turn into the most egregious crimes. Do you know how many people were killed in the Soviet Union? We talk. The numbers are estimates. The estimated numbers are 28 million. That's 28 million. Okay, just understand. Those are the estimated numbers in the name of justice, and that's yes. And that we're forgetting the Ukrainian crisis and the starvation in the 30s. 28 million people. And look what's happened in China. Do we even know the numbers? What's happened under the banner of the sickle and the hammer? Right? Just think about that. Which means to say an idea is not real until it is expressed in practice. And when practice shows it doesn't work, that idea is deformed. That's what's the big idea. You can't stamp it now. It could be you can't stamp out an idea, but it's not real, says Torah, until it gets onto the parchment, and the parchment goes past the heart, and it failed that test. In a more, we'll call it less, in a less scary expression of this, there was if anybody has ever read or watched the original Jurassic Park before it became a moneymaker. Before it became thank you. Before it became a moneymaker for multiple sequels. If you go back to the original theory of Jurassic Park, there's such a fascinating conversation which is had between the scientists and the investors. And the investors are talking about, this is fantastic. Here we are, we've recreated life from millions of years ago, and we're going to have this park, and everybody's going to come and see this, and it's fantastic. This is a scientific advance and revolution. And what the scientists argue is, before you've had a chance to think about this idea, you've slapped it on a sticker on a plastic lunchbox, and you're selling it already before understanding the ramifications of playing with life. And it doesn't work out. And at the end of the whole saga, one of the investors, the owner of the institution, says, what the problem was? The reason why this all broke down is too much automation. It was too reliant on electricity. When there's a hurricane and the power went out, and he missed the point. What was the point? Is that when you try to capture life, when you try to play with life, life finds a way. The point is that you can't. It's an idea which doesn't work. You know why it doesn't work? Because it doesn't work in practice. Because practice includes the crassness, the ego, the jealousy, the investments of human beings. That's what real ideas look like, is when you put it into practice. And that is part of it, animal farm. But the point is that you need, an idea cannot exist by itself. An idea has to exist in practice. And if it doesn't exist in practice, it isn't a real idea. Which is why Judaism is so unique. Judaism, in a certain sense, we're still here 300 years ago, still doing some of the things. And yes, in sometimes deformed ways, and yes, in compromised fashion sometimes, we're still doing the things that still mattered. Let's look. I want to give 3 examples. Perhaps people might associate with some more than others, but one example is prayer. So the Torah talks about prayer. It's an idea, right? So the Torah talks about in source 9, the Rambam says at the beginning of Hilchos Tefillah, we talk about every day. You should serve Hashem your God. What's avodah shebelev? It refers to tefillah. Fantastic, beautiful idea. Very esoteric, very, so to speak, very out there. Very little detail as to what we should be doing about that, which is how it started. Which means that when this is the way it used to be, you know what people used to do? They would sit on the top of a mountaintop, looking at God, and they're looking at the landscape, and they would say, "God, you're magnificent. Thank you for life. I feel that you've done something in my life." However, that didn't work. Because over time, as reality, as experience, as the human experience changed, the idea needed to also change as well. And therefore, says the Rambam in the top of page 7, he says, Im hayaragil marbe betchina uvakasha, im hayarel svasai medaber kafi yachaltai v'chol es shirtzeh. So at the beginning, it was really as a person expressed themselves. It was an organic reflection of a person's relationship with the Almighty. However, Kevon Shegalu Yisrael, in the next paragraph, B'mei Nebuchadnezzar, at the exile in the first base of the Mikdash, Nisarvu b'fras v'yavon v'shara umois v'noldu lohem bonim ba'artzos hagoyim. Jews were born in foreign lands, Babylon, wherever they were taken in this exile. It's very unfair words. It's really it's a reflection of exactly what it is. Their language got mixed up in those languages. People couldn't really find full expression. They weren't articulate enough. They weren't educated enough to be able to do this. When Nehemiah came back to the land of Israel, in the Second Commonwealth, he said most of them were speaking Ashdodis. That's referring to the language, whatever there was there. It was whatever that Semitic language was. They didn't even know how to speak the Jewish language. So a person could even express himself in Lashon HaKodesh, and he says it seems to be that even in another language he was deficient. Interesting idea is language simply a means of expression, or is it actually educating the ideas itself? Apparently, the Rambam is saying it limited the person's ability to even ask. The Kevon Shira Ezra based in Kach Amdu v'tiknu lahem shmone esrei brachos al haseder. That's when Ezra said, you know what, we need to standardize this. We need to regulate this process, and that's what they did. And they created the Shmona Esrei, they created the brachos, because they needed us to have some sort of, to concretize what at that point up till then was an idea, and that idea was too ethereal, was too far removed from this world, and they concretize that idea into the format that we have it with the sacrifices made, with the many sacrifices made, is because now I'm being forced to say somebody else's words, even though those are deeply profound and prophetic words, but they are still somebody else's words. Let's take a moment to appreciate the magnificence of that sacrifice and that decision. In source 10, in Rabbi Ben Elau's book, The Sages, which is really excellent. And he has a 4-volume set on Pirkei Avos, and it's really goes through the background of the sages. Take a look at in source 10, second paragraph. He says, he's quoting the Gemara in Brachos, which is the men of the Great Assembly enacted blessings and prayers, sanctifications and idolaters for Israel. The sentence from the Talmud embodies a wealth of material concerning the activities of the men of the Great Assembly. The single phrase, blessings and prayers, encompasses almost the entirety of our religious world. Can a person be religious without reciting blessings and prayers? Our daily routine is almost inconceivable in their absence, since one's entire daily connection to God is summed up in these 2 words, blessings and prayers. Without a blessing or prayer, we have no stable meeting point with God, and are left only with the spontaneous overtures at times of grace or joy or heavenward of crisis. That's what it used to be. The men of the Great Assembly understood that life of the simple people, far from the temple, a rural farmer perhaps, had no spiritual dimension or possibility of touching the holy. They saw that only by formalizing the relationship between the individual and his creator would all people have access to their inner spiritual lives. Prayers and blessings introduced a framework of basic religious consciousness into the religious world of the layman. And therefore, he concludes, this was a revolution that called upon every Jew to participate actively in the service of God, rather than simply rely on the knowledge that sacrifices were being offered in the temple on his behalf. Note that Ezra did this when the Beis Hamikdash was around already. This was already when the second Beis Hamikdash was built, and he said, nonetheless, we need to democratize this idea into a specific, concrete expression. What a remarkable idea. And I think about this a lot today, because, sometimes it's a very disheartening thing to think about Jews and prayer. Right? Everybody's got, first of all, there's just so many nuschas. Everybody's got their own nusach. And then everybody's does it their own way, right? Some people like to jump up and down and scream, right? Some people like to silently stand there. Some people like to talk through the whole davening. Some people, right? It's disheartening, and you say, is it really working? And the answer is, you know what? Despite all the complexities of human practice and baggage, right? We all come with the baggage of our childhood and the experiences in our school and the way our parents and grandparents educated us, whether through osmosis or specifically. We come with all of that and we're still doing it somehow. That's remarkable. Just for a moment, stop and think about that. What the Anshe Knesset Agdola did 2,500 years ago in this enactment, in this reducing an idea into a practical experience, is still happening with all the problems that it has. Yes, Rabbi, it's 28 minutes and it should be 33 minutes. I know, but we're still doing it. That's the point, is that somehow this idea stood the test of time. And yes, there are many Jews who don't pray. That's true. There are still many Jews. And that's a question in general about their connection to their tradition itself, not about prayer. Their connection to tradition as a whole, their identity. But those who are close enough to what it means to be traditionally Jewish are all somehow managing to do this in their own way. And yes, through life we go through ups and downs, and sometimes I'm a 1 day a week person, and sometimes I'm a 2 day a week person, but I'm getting there. I'm on the trajectory of connecting to this idea, the idea which stood the test of time. Let's take another example. The Moshe Rabbeinu comes brings the nation of Israel out of Egypt. And they're all standing in the cusp of Egypt. They have their bags on their back, and this is the first time nobody imagined this moment. And you think, what would the speech be? Moshe Rabbeinu gets up on the podium, and he needs to address the people. This is the moment. Now you may say, okay, so maybe wait until after Kriyas Yamsuf, because we don't really know. We're out of the coop yet. So maybe give him 7 days. But what would Moshe Rabbeinu say? What would the words emblazoned into all history be? And you can think about options as to what that could be. You could think about the Gettysburg Address. This would be that their sacrifice of your brethren and children and grandparents was not in vain. Right? You could think about Nelson Mandela's long walk to freedom. It was arduous and it was difficult. There's all these iconic moments that he could have trademarked long before anybody else did it. And what does he do? The one thing he says is 3 times over the end of Parashas Bo, just as Israel leaves the land of Egypt, is the most counterintuitive idea, which seems to be completely missing the boat, and that is education. He talks about, this is where 3 of the 4 sons in the Haggadah appear, is the end of Parashas Bo in source 12. That refers to the Ben. Which son? Is? The Rasha. Then in source 13, which son's that referring to? Who's that? When you tell your son, he's not asking. That's the She'eni Yodeh Lishol, because he's not even asking the question. And then a few psukim later, when your son says, "What's this?" That is not the Chacham. That's the Tam. So it's interesting. So those are the 3 sons. By the way, the Chacham is found in Parshas Vayeschanan. The Chacham is a person who, from a, so to speak, a unexperiential moment, is looking at this and saying, I'd like to find out more about my history. These folks are actually watching it and they're saying, wow. Right? So just to appreciate the differences of where people ask. But Moshe Rabbeinu talks about your children, educating your children. You say, why now? Why is it so important? Rabbi Sachs has the most beautiful essay. It's such an unbelievable essay on this. It appears in numerous of his writings, but this one's called The Far Horizon, and he says the following: it is one of the most counterintuitive acts in the history of leadership. Moses did not speak of today or tomorrow. He spoke about the distant future and the duty of parents to educate their children. He even hinted, as Jewish tradition understood, that we should encourage our children to ask questions, so that the handling of the Jewish heritage would not be matter of rote learning, but of active dialogue between parents and children. Judaism became the religion whose heroes were teachers, whose passion was study and the life of the mind. The Mesopotamians built ziggurats, the Egyptians built pyramids, the Greeks built a Parthian, Romans built the Colosseum, Jews built schools. That's why they alone, of all the civilizations of all the ancient world, are still alive and strong, still continuing their ancestors' vocation, their heritage intact and undiminished. Think about that. What a far-reaching idea. Everybody wants to find immortality. Still today, we want our names on stone. We want to find some way that we will be remembered. Let's find something that we can make a mark on. Moshe Rabbeinu says, you want to know how to do that? Speak to your children. Speak to your grandchildren. Make sure that they're carrying the same banner. What a remarkable idea. In fact, there's just to take this one step further. Oh, our timing is against us, but I'm going to leave out this next source. But it is important. The Gemara says that there was a person by the name of Yoshua ben Gamla, very complicated individual. Yoshua ben Gamla lived at the end of the second Beis Hamikdash period. He was a Kohen Gadol. He got into the position not through his own merit. He married Marta Bas Baitos, who was a very influential family, and he got the role of Kohen Gadol. But nonetheless, despite the fact that his initial career there were misgivings about, he instituted the most important thing, says the Gemara in Baba Basra, Zachar Osai Ish Latov. You know what he instituted? The most important thing that exists today, and that is the Jewish day school system. Why? He realized that up till then, how was Jewish education, where was the center of Jewish education? The home, right? It was patriarchal, right? So it was in the process of education in the home. But what happens if you have a home which can't educate? What happens if you have a parent who's not able to educate? What happens if you have a single parent family? What happens if you have a zero parent family, right? Orphans. Where does education happen? And he says, therefore, we need to have a way to be able to educate our children for the next generation. And he said, you know what, let's bring all the children together. And he said at 16 or 17, we'll put them all together and educate them. And he said, this is not working. You know why? Because they're teenagers. He says we need to start at 6 and 7. So that's what we call first grade. And he brought them all together in every location, called plach v'plach, says the Gemara. In every location, he says, let us now outsource education so that everybody has a chance at the future. The Gemara says, Il Malay Osai Ish, Nishtachar Torah min Israel. The Torah would have been forgotten for Israel. In Rabbi Sachs's Letters to the Next Generation, which is a very beautiful book written to students of the next generation, he says the following. He says, but they were more than that. For Jews, education is not just what we know, it's who we are. No people ever cared for education more. Our ancestors were the first to make an education a religious command, and the first to create compulsory universal system of schooling, 18 centuries before Britain. The rabbis valued study as higher even than prayer. Almost 2,000 years ago, Josephus wrote, should anyone of our nation be asked about our laws, he will repeat them as readily as his own name. The result of our thorough education in our laws from the very dawn of intelligence is that they are, as it were, engraved on our souls. Meaning an idea in practice. That's what Moshe Rabbeinu said. Is let it not remain an idea, let it not remain etched in stone, let it remain etched in the hearts of the individuals of the future. And he quotes at the very end, he said, the Jews in the Eastern Europe used to say, to be an apikoros, a heretic, is understandable, but to be an amaoretz, an ignoramus, is unforgivable. Folks, most of society today is ignoramus. Most people today don't have opinions because they educate themselves based on headlines. Nobody has qualified opinions on anything that's going on because they don't even read. They don't have enough patience to even investigate what's going on. That's the society we're living in. God forfend that the Jewish people become ignoramuses. Thank you again. And I'd like to give one expression of this idea, which I think was remarkable. There's a fascinating Israeli media company called Open Door Media, or Unpacked. It used to be originally Jerusalem U, and they moved into the education sphere. And they put out a very fascinating video recently that was based on actually some of the theory that they consulted Dr. Abramson on. And I thought it was a very fascinating video. It was called "Why Did the Jews Not Fight Back?" And it was about Holocaust history. Did the Jews fight back? And it's a 15-minute video. It's really worthwhile. Read it. Dr. Abramson did the theory behind. There's a lady who presents it. A very, very well researched documentary about this concept, something which a lot of us have trouble dealing with. And she goes through a number of the different iterations of fighting back. And then she says something which I just thought was really remarkable. And she talks about the Bialski brothers, and these are partisans. These were Jewish brothers. Three of them who there were five of them, but three of them who survived. There was Tuvia, Asael, and Zus, who managed in the early 40s to pull a number of their family members into the forest, and they began as partisans at the beginning. They started just with 30 people of their extended family and friends, and then they realized as the Jews were being rounded up and taken to the extermination that they needed to do more, and they went deeper into the Naliboki forest. I'm not sure if that's the correct pronunciation. This is in the Lithuanian Belarus area, and they ultimately, as they went deeper into the forest, despite the manhunts where the Germans, listen to this, Germans used 20,000 troops to pan the forests to find the partisans and groups like them. I mean, can you imagine? The war effort is going on, and you could really be fighting, but they're looking for hidden Jews. But nonetheless, they set up essentially deep in the furthest reaches of this inaccessible forest a community of 700 Jews who escaped the Nazis. And in this community, just to take a look on top of page 13, what I just think is a remarkable statement, is that it was a primitive and unlikely setting that the Bielski group created a community. Despite some opposition from within the group, Tuvi Bielski never wavered from his determination to accept and protect all Jewish refugees, regardless of age or gender. The Bielskis never turned anyone away, permitting the creation of a mobile family camp, in effect, a Jewish community in the forest. The group organized skilled workers among the Jewish refugees into workshops, which employed at least 200 people, including cobblers, tailors, carpenters, leather workers, and blacksmiths. In addition, the group established a mill, bakery, laundry. The leadership managed a primitive infirmary, a school for children, and a synagogue. That's what they all did in the forest. That's amazing. Now, what the argument is made. Did the Jews fight back? You want to know the answer if the Jews fought back? If in the middle of the war, when every person who has got a Jewish grandparent is being sent to a gas chamber, you set up a school, do you know what that means? That means to say that you believe that you're going to win and there's going to be a future. That's how the Jews fought back, because we always believed. Every yeshiva has been reestablished. There's a Mir, there's a Slobodka, they may be in different locations, but there has been a continuation of Jewish education throughout and despite, which means that the idea worked. That's the point. And yes, compromised, and yes, there are problems, but you know what? It worked. That's amazing. That's amazing. The idea never died because it was an idea wedded with practice. It was a ois, which was mukaf gevil. It was embedded in the consciousness of what it means to be a Jew, and it still worked in the depth of this inaccessible forest. One last idea. The Gemara tells us, and we'll close with this. The Gemara tells us in Meseches Yoma that if they know that somebody has been fallen, a ruin has fallen over a person. God forbid, there's a tsunami, there's an earthquake. Right? The Gemara says, if they know that the person's alive, then you can even on Shabbos go through the rubble. God forbid, unfortunately, when we saw on Surfside, right? The Israeli teams are working day and night. You can do that as long as you know that there's a chance of life. You mechalal Shabbos to save lives. Why? The Gemara says because dafilu l'chayei shah, even if that person is only going to live for a few hours, that's sufficient grounds to be able to do what's necessary to Mechalal Shabbos to save that person. The Gemara asks an interesting question, because the Gemara says like this in Avodah Zarah on Daf Chav Zayin Beis. Take a look at in source 21, third line. Amar Rava, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Lo, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Yochanan is quoted by different people as saying, Safek Chai, Safek Meis, and Misrapin Mahen. Let's say a person we don't know if they're going to live. They cannot consult, and this is referring to the days where we're not talking about where there's a Hippocratic oath, and we're not talking about standardized medicine and a judicial system, but there will be non-Jewish doctors were dangerous to Jews. Right? It was seen as a credible threat to life to consult a non-Jewish doctor because there was no transparency, there was no ratings online. It was more or less likely that this person could kill you just because you're a Jew, right? And so they said, it's better to remain in a state of safek, of we don't know if this person's terminal, rather than to put oneself into such a person's clause. Right? Now, obviously, things are different today, but just understand the reality that we're dealing with. Vadai meis, let's say a person is definitely terminal. There's no way to get out of this. Then, misrapin mehen, then you can consult a non-Jewish physician. So the Gemara says, but what about Chayesha? Surely he's going to have a few more hours now, but then if he goes there, who knows? He says, the Chayesha loy chashin. The Gemara says, we don't worry about Chayesha. We don't worry about those extra hours you could have got in bed in a terminal illness. He says, not timra de l'chayesha loy chashin. How do you know this concept? Dichsiv, this because the Pasuk tells us in Tanakh, im amarnu navoya ir v'harav ba'ir and b'masnu sham. Well, so what this refers to, the Arba Mitzorayim, these lepers who are kicked out of camp, these are Gehazi and his sons, who don't have access to food. The famine is so powerful. There's no food in Israel. There's been a drought and a famine. People have nothing to eat. They say, if we stay here, we're going to die. So you know what we should do? Let's go to the camp of Aram. Yes, they're going to kill us, but if we stay here, we're going to die. So you see, what do you see? They should just stay and die. Maybe they would have a chance. No, they still put themselves in danger's way. So this is so it says Tosus, but wait a second. We are concerned about Chayei Shah. We are concerned if a person is, as we saw, if a person is even there's a remote chance of saving that person, we will be Machal Shabbos to unpack the rubble just to find them. So we are concerned about Chayei Shah. You're telling me that no, you don't worry about a little bit of life because you know what, maybe. So it says Tosus on the top of the page, on the top right, Sagal, you can it goes to the rabble. The Shabbos lachush l'chayisha al machashinan. He says, we always are concerned what is for the best of the patient. If you don't go through the rubble, that person is going to die. Right? So you need to be Mechal Shabbos to save that person. If you leave the person in this case, they're definitely going to die. Which means you have to assess every situation, which comes down to questions in medical treatments. Which means, and this is the halacha, right? That means to say that if there's a treatment, you have to analyze how much danger is there in such a treatment or this intervention, and how much of a percentage of death is there without the treatment. And that's a very complicated question, but it depends is what is the most likely to let this person live? Which means that Judaism introduced into a world which was devoid of this conception, the notion of sanctity of life. We care about life, no matter how much life, no matter how little, no matter what the condition or quality of that life is, we care about life, which informs our medical decision-making today, which informs in the world which speaks about quality of life, we talk about sanctity of life, and yes, we worry about quality of life. It does impact the decision-making, but sanctity of life is not a language which is talked about in the environment around us, in society around us. This idea has impacted us so much so that I proudly say that if you look at the Israeli Army's Code of Conduct, in Source 22, it has many lines, it's available online, you can read the whole thing. IDF soldiers will not use their weapons and force to harm human beings who are not combatants or prisoners of war, and will do all in their power to avoid causing harm to their lives, bodies, dignity, and property. Folks, are there mistakes that are made? Yes. Are there bad soldiers? There are. But you know what? Listen to the statistics for a moment. 3 statistics that are worthwhile knowing. Today, militaries are supposed to be constrained by the laws of armed conflict or the international humanitarian law, which exist in large part to protect civilians during the times of war. The IHL requires armed forces to act only to achieve legitimate military objectives, to distinguish between civilians and combatants, and to avoid causing disproportionate damage to civilians who may be near to a legitimate military target. Despite often being forced to engage in urban warfare against terrorist groups that hide behind civilians and fire rockets from densely populated areas, the IDF has met and often exceeded the highest standards of the IHL and LOAC. This is, you can read the paper. When it suspects civilians are near a military target, the IDF warns them to evacuate with phone calls, text message leaflets, and other means. It also aborts many operations to avoid harming innocent people. Indeed, the IDF's tactics go often beyond what is required by the Geneva Conventions. In a 2015 report about the IDF, military leaders from other liberal democracies expressed strong concerns that the actions and practices of the IDF to prevent collateral damage were so extensive that they would curtail the effectiveness of our own militaries, were they to become constraining norms in warfare enacted in law. Which means no other country can abide by the care and sanctity of life that the IDF provides. The collateral damage in the Israeli army the right word is not exceeds, but is so much less than what the armed or joint forces of the West did anything in the Middle East over the course of the Iran-Afghanistan war. It is almost shocking. Which means to say, again, is it perfect? No. Are there exceptions? Of course. But in the end of the day, the idea didn't die. And that means to say is that ideas matter. And when ideas are matched with practice, when they are surrounded by that parchment throughout our lives, they actually change the way we act. And the Jewish nation acts differently in this regard as a function of that. So the question then comes back is, do ideas matter? And the question is, what ideas? And how are they nested in experience itself? Rabbi, I thank you so much for your time today. Ezra Hashem, we'll continue. And just a quick reminder that next week,